Anne Frank, The Diary That Gave a Voice to the Holocaust, Part 1. Europe before Anne Frank. The Treaty of Versailles ended the First World War in 1919, but it also created the conditions for catastrophe. Germany faced economic ruin, territorial loss, and a national humiliation that festered in the collective consciousness. Millions of Germans struggled through hyperinflation, unemployment, and political chaos. In this environment of desperation and resentment, extremist movements found fertile ground. Adolf Hitler joined the National Socialist German Workers' Party in 1919 and quickly rose through its ranks. By 1933, he had become Chancellor of Germany. The Nazi ideology rested on racial pseudoscience, extreme nationalism, and virulent antisemitism. Jews were blamed for Germany's defeat in the war, for economic collapse, and for a supposed conspiracy to undermine German culture. These were lies, but they were repeated with relentless propaganda and eventually accepted by millions. Within months of Hitler's appointment, the Nazi regime began dismantling democratic institutions. The Enabling Act of March 1933 gave Hitler dictatorial powers. That same year, the first concentration camp opened at Dachau to imprison political opponents. Jewish citizens faced immediate persecution. On April 1, 1933, the Nazi Party organized a nationwide boycott of Jewish businesses. Stormtroopers stood outside shops with signs reading "Don't buy from Jews." Professional restrictions followed rapidly. The law for the restoration of the professional civil service removed Jews from government positions, teaching posts, and the legal profession. For German Jewish families, the message was clear. The country they had called home for generations no longer wanted them. Among those who recognized the danger early was Otto Frank, a Frankfurt businessman. In 1933, he made the decision to leave Germany. He moved first to Amsterdam, where he established a business selling pectin and spices. His wife Edith and their daughters Margot and Anne would follow. The Franks became refugees, joining hundreds of thousands of Jews fleeing Nazi Germany. They sought safety in the Netherlands, believing the Dutch commitment to neutrality would protect them. It was a reasonable hope, but history would prove them tragically wrong. Sources used *. The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William L. Shirer, pages 191–237. Anne Frank, The Biography by Melissa Mueller, pages 1842. The Holocaust by Martin Gilbert, pages 2857. The Hidden Life of Otto Frank by Carol Ann Lee, pages 3361. Part 2, Childhood and Family. Anneliese Marie Frank was born on June 12, 1929, in Frankfurt am Main, Germany. Her parents, Otto and Edith Frank, came from established Jewish families. Otto had served as a lieutenant in the German army during the First World War and had built a career in banking and business. Edith, born Edith Hollander, came from a prosperous family in Aachen. Their older daughter Margot Betty Frank had been born 3 years earlier in 1926. Anne's early childhood in Frankfurt was brief. By the time she was 4 years old, the family had relocated to Amsterdam. Otto established Opteworks, a company that sold pectin used in making jam. The family settled into an apartment in the River Quarter, a southern neighborhood popular with German Jewish refugees. Anne and Margot attended the Montessori school on Neerstraat. Anne proved to be bright, talkative, and outgoing. Her teachers noted her sociability, though her report cards also mentioned she talked too much in class. In Amsterdam, Anne developed close friendships, particularly with a girl named Hannelie Goslar. She loved reading and collected photographs of movie stars, which she pasted into a notebook. According to those who knew her, including Miep Gies, who would later help hide the family, Anne was lively and curious, with a particular gift for storytelling and mimicry. These observations come from multiple first-hand accounts and are consistent with what Anne herself later wrote in her diary. The relative security of Amsterdam ended on May 10, 1940, when German forces invaded the Netherlands. Despite Dutch resistance, The country surrendered within 5 days. The Nazi occupation brought immediate consequences for the Jewish population. In October 1940, all Jewish-owned businesses had to be registered. Otto was forced to transfer his company to non-Jewish associates to keep it operating. In 1941, Jewish children were expelled from public schools and required to attend separate Jewish schools. Anne and Margot transferred to the Jewish Lyceum. The restrictions intensified throughout 1941 and into 1942. Jews were banned from public parks, swimming pools, theaters, and cafes. They could only shop during restricted hours. From May 1942, all Jews over the age of 6 were required to wear a yellow Star of David on their clothing. The Frank family complied with these humiliating regulations, while Otto quietly made preparations. He began moving furniture and supplies to a hidden space in the building that housed his business at Prinsengracht 263. These preparations were undertaken with the help of trusted colleagues who would risk their own lives to assist the family. On Anne's 13th birthday, June 12, 1942, Otto and Edith gave her a red and white checkered autograph album. Anne immediately decided to use it as a diary. She addressed her entries to Kitty, an imaginary friend, and began recording her thoughts and daily experiences. These early entries describe her school life, her crushes on boys, and her relationships with friends. Within weeks, the diary would take on far greater historical significance. Sources used: Anne Frank, The Biography by Melissa Mueller, pages 43-98. The Diary of a Young Girl, The Definitive Edition, pages 126. Anne Frank Remembered by Miep Gies, pages 1168. The Hidden Life of Otto Frank by Carol Ann Lee, pages 62-103. The Netherlands and Nazi Genocide, edited by Bob Moore, pages 47-89. Part 3, Life in the Secret Annex. On July 5, 1942, Margot Frank received a call-up notice from the SS ordering her to report for forced labor in Germany. Otto and Edith Frank knew what such notices really meant. Deportation to labor camps in the East was often a death sentence. The family immediately put their long-prepared plan into action. On the morning of July 6, 1942, they left their apartment carrying as many belongings as they could wear in layers of clothing. Leaving anything that might suggest flight, including Anne's beloved cat, they walked through the rain to Prinsengracht 263. The hiding place, which Anne would call the Secret Annex, was located in the rear of the building that housed Otto's former business. Access was through the main office, then up a narrow staircase concealed behind a movable bookcase that Otto's employees later installed. The annex consisted of several small rooms spread over 2 floors plus an attic. It was cramped, airless, and had windows that needed to remain covered during daylight hours. The Franks were not alone in hiding. They were joined by Herman van Pels, who had worked with Otto in the spice business, his wife August, and their 15-year-old son Peter. In November 1942, an 8th person arrived, Fritz Pfeffer, a dentist who was a friend of the Frank family. These 8 people would live in the secret annex for just over 2 years. Daily life in the annex followed strict rules. During business hours, when workers occupied the front building, those in hiding had to remain completely silent. They could not flush the toilet, run water, or move around. Anne described the oppressive quiet in her diary, writing how they had to whisper and walk in stockinged feet. Only after the workers left each evening could the hidden families move freely, speak normally, and breathe somewhat easier. 4 employees of Otto's business knew about the people in hiding and kept them alive. Miep Gies and her husband Jan provided food, supplies, and news from the outside world. Johannes Kleiman and Victor Kugler managed the business and maintained the deception. Bep Voskuil also helped, bringing books, magazines, and companionship. These helpers risked immediate imprisonment or death under Nazi occupation laws. Anne's diary became the most detailed record of life in the secret annex. She wrote nearly every day, documenting not only events but also her internal life. She described the friction between the families, the fear that came with every unexpected noise, and her own development from a girl into a young woman. She wrote about her difficult relationship with her mother, her admiration for her father, and her developing romantic feelings for Peter van Pels. In March 1944, Anne heard a radio broadcast by Gerrit Balkestein, the Dutch Minister of Education in exile in London. He urged the Dutch people to preserve diaries and documents as testimony to their suffering under occupation. Anne was deeply moved. She began revising her diary entries with the intention of publishing them after the war under the title Het Terhuis, or The Secret Annex. She rewrote passages, combined entries, and edited her work with a writer's eye toward creating a coherent narrative. This revision demonstrates that Anne understood her diary's potential historical importance while still in hiding. Her writing also reveals her literary ambitions. She wrote short stories, fairy tales, and essays that she collected in a separate notebook. She created her book of beautiful sentences, copying quotations she admired. The diary entries themselves show remarkable insight and self-awareness for someone so young. In an entry from April 5, 1944, she reflected on how people had two sides, an outward personality and an inner self, writing with psychological depth that many adult memoirists struggle to achieve. The diary also documents the hardships. Food became increasingly scarce. The hidden families survived on rations supplemented by what their helpers could obtain on the black market. They ate rotting potatoes and moldy bread. Illness spread in the cramped, poorly ventilated space. Fear was constant. Air raid sirens sent them to the lower floors. Break-ins at the building terrified them. Every sound from the warehouse below raised the possibility of discovery. Yet Anne also recorded moments of hope, humor, and ordinary teenage concerns. She argued with her mother about fashion and boys. She daydreamed about returning to school. She fell in love with Peter and wrote about their first kiss. On July 15, 1944, she wrote one of her most famous passages, reflecting that despite everything, she still believed that people were truly good at heart. This sentence has been quoted countless times, though scholars have noted it should be understood in context of a young person clinging to optimism amid horror, not as a comprehensive philosophy about human nature. Sources used: The Diary of a Young Girl, the definitive edition, pages 27-333. Anne Frank, the biography by Melissa Mueller, pages 99-234. Anne Frank, remembered by Miep Gies, pages 69-182. The Anne Frank House, an illustrated journey through Anne's world by Menno Metselaar and Ruud van der Rohe, pages 35-87. Anne Frank, the book The Life, the Afterlife by Francine Prose, pages 71-149. Part 4, Discovery, Arrest, and Deportation. On the morning of August 4, 1944, an SD officer named Carl Joseph Silberbauer, accompanied by Dutch Nazi collaborators from the Amsterdam police, arrived at Prinsengracht 263. They went directly to the movable bookcase and entered the secret annex. The informant who betrayed the hiding place has never been conclusively identified, though historians have investigated several suspects over the decades. The most extensive investigation, conducted by the Netherlands Institute for War Documentation, concluded that multiple theories remained plausible, but none could be proven beyond doubt. Suspects have included Wilhelm van Maren, a warehouse worker with a criminal record, and Lena Hartog, whose husband also worked in the building. In 2022, a team of investigators using modern forensic techniques proposed that Arnold van den Berg, a Jewish notary, may have betrayed the annex to protect his own family, though this theory remains controversial and has been questioned by the Anne Frank House and other scholars. What is certain is that someone provided the authorities with specific information about the hiding place. The 8 people in the secret annex were arrested along with 2 of their helpers, Johannes Kleiman and Victor Kugler. Miep Gies and Bepp Voskuil were not arrested, though they easily could have been. The prisoners were taken first to SD headquarters for interrogation, then to a detention center, before being sent to Westerbork, a transit camp in the northeastern Netherlands. At Westerbork, the Frank family and the others were classified as criminal cases rather than regular internees because they had been caught in hiding. This meant harsher treatment and immediate priority for deportation to the east. They were assigned to punishment barracks and forced to perform hard labor. Anne and Margot broke apart old batteries to salvage metal and other materials, work that left their hands cut and burned. On September 3, 1944, the last transport train from Westerbork to Auschwitz departed with over 1,000 people crammed into sealed freight cars. The Frank family, the Van Pels family, and Fritz Pfeffer were on that train. The journey took 3 days. Survivors of that transport later described the unbearable conditions. No food, no water, no sanitation, people dying in the darkness. The train arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau on the night of September 5, 1944. SS doctors conducted selection on the platform. Those deemed fit for labor were sent to one side. Those deemed unfit, including most children, the elderly, and the sick, were sent immediately to the gas chambers. Of the 1,019 people on that transport, 549 were murdered within hours of arrival. Anne, Margot, Edith, and Otto survived the initial selection. Herman Van Pels was sent to the gas chambers shortly after arrival. August Van Pels and Peter Van Pels were selected for labor. Fritz Pfeffer was sent to the Neuengamme concentration camp, where he died on December 20, 1944. Men and women were separated immediately. Otto Frank never saw his wife or daughters again after the selection. Anne and Margot were tattooed with identification numbers and sent to the women's camp. Survivors who knew them at Auschwitz, including Hannelie Goslar, who was imprisoned in another section of the camp, later provided testimony about the conditions. The women were stripped, shaved, and forced into hard labor with minimal food. Disease was rampant. Death was constant. In late October 1944, as Soviet forces approached from the east, the SS began evacuating prisoners westward. Anne and Margot were selected for transport to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in northwestern Germany. Edith Frank remained behind at Auschwitz, too weak to be moved. She died there of starvation and exhaustion on January 6, 1945, just weeks before Soviet forces liberated the camp. Sources used ***. Anne Frank, The Biography by Melissa Mueller, pages 235–289. The Diary of a Young Girl, The Critical Edition, pages 183 of the Scholarly Apparatus. K.L. A History of the Nazi Concentration Camps by Nikolaus Wachsman, pages 456–523. The Hidden Life of Otto Frank by Carol Ann Lee, pages 159–203. Auschwitz, A New History by Lawrence Rees, pages 267–301. The Betrayal of Anne Frank, A Cold Case Investigation by Rosemary Sullivan, pages 187–312, noting significant scholarly criticism of conclusions. Part 5, Death and Survival of Otto Frank. Bergen-Belsen was not originally designed as an extermination camp, but by late 1944 it had become a death trap. The camp was vastly overcrowded with prisoners evacuated from camps in the east. There were no gas chambers at Bergen-Belsen, but tens of thousands died from starvation, disease, and neglect. Sanitation was virtually non-existent. Corpses lay unburied for days or weeks. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis spread unchecked. Anne and Margot Frank arrived at Bergen-Belsen in late October or early November 1944. Several women who knew them there later provided testimony. Hannelie Goslar, Anne's childhood friend, encountered her at Bergen-Belsen under extraordinary circumstances. They were in different sections of the camp separated by barbed wire, but they managed to speak briefly on several occasions. Goslar later recounted that Anne told her both their parents were dead and that she and Margot were alone. Anne did not know that Otto had survived. The winter of 1944–1945 at Bergen-Belsen was catastrophic. Food rations dwindled to almost nothing. There was no heat. A typhus epidemic swept through the camp. Both Anne and Margot contracted the disease. Various witnesses, including Rachel van Amerongen Frankfurter and Jannie Brands Brilleslaper, later testified that both sisters became severely ill in February 1945. The exact dates of their deaths are not known with certainty. For many years, it was believed they died in March 1945, just weeks before British forces liberated the camp on April 15, 1945. However, research conducted by the Anne Frank House in 2015 concluded that based on witness testimonies, both sisters likely died in February 1945, possibly even earlier than previously thought. Margot appears to have died first. One witness reported that Margot fell from her bunk bed and was too weak to get up. Anne died shortly afterward, probably within days. They were among approximately 50,000 people who died at Bergen-Belsen. Otto Frank survived Auschwitz. When Soviet forces liberated the camp on January 27, 1945, he was in the camp infirmary, seriously ill but alive. He was the only one of the 8 people from the Secret Annex to survive the war. His recovery took months. He made his way slowly westward through Poland and the Soviet Union, traveling through Odessa and Marseille before finally reaching Amsterdam on June 3, 1945. He immediately sought news of his family. He learned quickly that Edith had died at Auschwitz. For weeks he held hope that Anne and Margot might have survived. He placed advertisements in newspapers and contacted the Red Cross. In July 1945, he received confirmation that both his daughters were dead. Miep Gies had preserved Anne's diary. On the afternoon of August 4, 1944, after the arrest, Miep and Bepp Voskuil had returned to the Secret Annex. They gathered up papers scattered on the floor, including Anne's diary notebooks and loose pages. Miep locked them in a drawer of her desk without reading them, hoping to return them to Anne after the war. When Otto Frank returned to Amsterdam, Miep gave him the papers. She told him she had not read them because they were Anne's private thoughts. Otto began reading his daughter's diary. He later wrote that he had not truly known Anne. The depth of her thoughts, her literary talent, and her internal life were revelations to him. He typed excerpts and sent them to his mother, who had emigrated to Switzerland. Friends and family encouraged him to seek publication, though Otto was initially reluctant to share something so personal. Sources used **. Anne Frank, the biography by Melissa Mueller, pages 290–321. The Death of Anne Frank by Willy Lindwer, originally published as The Last 7 Months of Anne Frank, pages 47–185. K.L. A History of the Nazi Concentration Camps by Nikolaus Wachsmann, pages 547–592. Anne Frank Remembered by Miep Gies, pages 183–237. The Hidden Life of Otto Frank by Carol Ann Lee, pages 204–246. Research findings published by the Anne Frank House, 2015, regarding revised death dates. Part 6, Publication of the Diary and Global Impact. Otto Frank spent months editing Anne's diary for publication. He faced difficult choices. Anne herself had begun revising her entries with publication in mind, but she had not completed the work. Otto combined material from her original diary with her revised version. He removed passages he considered too private, including Anne's emerging sexuality, her critical comments about her mother, and references to marital tensions between her parents. He also omitted passages about bodily functions that he believed would be inappropriate for publication in the 1940s. The first edition, titled Hedichterhuis, or The Secret Annex, was published in the Netherlands on June 25, 1947, by Contact Publishing. The initial print run of 3,000 copies sold slowly. Reviews were mixed. Some critics found it a moving document, while others questioned whether a teenager's diary merited publication. The Dutch public, exhausted by war and eager to move forward, was not immediately receptive to confronting the horror of the Holocaust. Gradually, however, the diary found readers. A second printing was issued. Otto sent copies to publishers in other countries. In 1950, a German translation was published despite significant resistance from German publishers who believed the public was not ready to confront Nazi crimes. The German edition sold well, particularly among younger readers. A French translation followed in 1950. The diary reached a far wider audience when it was published in the United States and Britain in 1952 under the title Anne Frank, The Diary of a Young Girl. The American edition became a bestseller. The book was widely reviewed and recommended by prominent figures including Eleanor Roosevelt, who wrote an introduction for the American edition. Translations into other languages followed rapidly. In 1955, a stage adaptation by Francis Goodrich and Albert Hackett premiered on Broadway. The play was a commercial and critical success, winning the Pulitzer Prize for Drama and the Tony Award for Best Play. It emphasized themes of hope and universal humanity while minimizing the specifically Jewish context of the Holocaust, a decision later criticized by scholars. The play nevertheless brought Anne Frank's story to millions who might never have read the diary. A film version directed by George Stevens was released in 1959, winning 3 Academy Awards. These adaptations, while taking artistic liberties, made Anne Frank a household name and her diary one of the most widely known books in the world. By the 1960s, the diary had been translated into dozens of languages and was being taught in schools around the world. The diary's authenticity was questioned by Holocaust deniers, who claimed it was a forgery. These false allegations prompted the Netherlands Institute for War Documentation to conduct a comprehensive forensic examination in the 1980s. The resulting critical edition, published in 1986, included extensive scientific analysis of the paper, ink, handwriting, and historical context. The examination conclusively proved the diary's authenticity. Forensic document examiners confirmed that all the writing was in Anne's hand. Paper and ink dating confirmed the materials were consistent with the 1940s. The critical edition also published all versions of the diary, showing the original entries, Anne's revisions, and Otto's editorial choices. Different editions of the diary have sparked scholarly debate. The original version published by Otto Frank omitted significant material. In 1986, the critical edition restored some of this content. In 1995, a definitive edition was published that included about 30% more material than Otto's original edition, restoring passages about Anne's sexuality, family tensions, and her more critical observations. These editions allow readers to understand both what Anne wrote and how her father shaped the first published version. The diary's influence extends beyond literature into education and historical memory. It has become one of the most important primary sources for teaching about the Holocaust. Educators value it because Anne's voice makes the abstract horror of genocide personally comprehensible. Her observations about daily life in hiding, her hopes and fears, and her struggle to maintain humanity in inhumane circumstances create emotional connection that historical statistics cannot achieve. Sources used: The Diary of a Young Girl, the critical edition, pages 59-93 of the scholarly apparatus. Anne Frank, the book The Life, the Afterlife by Francine Prose, pages 203-289. The Hidden Life of Otto Frank by Carol Ann Lee, pages 247-316. Publishing and the Commemoration of Anne Frank, The Diary in Context by David Barnow, pages 12-178. The Anne Frank Phenomenon, then and now edited by David Cesarani, pages 45–156. Part 7. Legacy and Historical Importance. Anne Frank has become one of the most recognized victims of the Holocaust, but this recognition carries both significance and complications. Her diary personalized the genocide of 6 million Jews, giving readers an intimate connection to one individual rather than overwhelming statistics. This personalization has proven crucial for Holocaust education, yet some scholars have argued that focusing on one articulate, gifted teenager risks obscuring the millions of others whose stories remain unknown. The diary's literary quality distinguishes it from other Holocaust memoirs and diaries. Anne was a talented writer with a novelist's eye for character and detail. Her descriptions of the people in the Secret Annex create vivid portraits. Her ability to articulate complex emotions and her development of a distinctive narrative voice make the diary compelling as literature, not merely as historical documentation. Literary critic Francine Prose has analyzed Anne's writing techniques, noting her use of dialogue, metaphor, and narrative structure that many adult writers struggle to achieve. The diary also documents a young woman's intellectual and emotional development. Anne wrote about her identity as a Jew, as a woman, and as a writer. She reflected on antisemitism and its irrationality. She thought deeply about human nature, morality, and the purpose of suffering. These reflections evolved as she matured. Early entries show a relatively carefree girl concerned with school and friendships. Later entries reveal someone grappling with profound questions about humanity, persecution, and survival. The physical preservation of the Secret Annex has become central to Holocaust memory. The building at Prinsengracht 263 was saved from demolition in 1957 when the Anne Frank Foundation was established to preserve it. The Anne Frank House opened as a museum in 1960. Today it receives over 1 million visitors annually, making it one of the most visited museums in the Netherlands. The museum preserves the actual rooms where the Frank family hid, allowing visitors to walk through the cramped space and see Anne's pictures of movie stars still pasted to her bedroom wall. Otto Frank dedicated the remainder of his life to sharing Anne's message. He answered thousands of letters from readers, met with school groups, and worked to promote tolerance and education. He remarried in 1953 to Elfriede Geringer Markowitz, herself a Holocaust survivor whose daughter had known Anne in Amsterdam. Otto remained actively involved with the Anne Frank House and various educational initiatives until his death in 1980 at age 91. The diary continues to generate scholarly research. Historians have used it to understand daily life under Nazi occupation, the practical mechanisms of hiding, and the psychology of living under constant threat. Gender studies scholars have analyzed Anne's emerging feminist consciousness and her observations about the restrictions placed on women. Literary scholars continue to assess her writing techniques and her place in the canon of war literature and memoir. Holocaust education programs worldwide use the diary as a primary text. Its accessibility to young readers makes it especially valuable in schools. Many students first learn about the Holocaust through Anne Frank. Educators note that her age makes her relatable to adolescent readers in ways that adult testimonies may not be. This educational role has introduced millions of people to Holocaust history and the broader questions it raises about prejudice, human rights, and moral responsibility. The diary has also played a role in combating Holocaust denial. Because Anne Frank's story is so well known and so thoroughly documented, attempts to deny her existence or the authenticity of her diary have been repeatedly debunked. Legal cases in multiple countries have established that denying the Holocaust or claiming the diary is a forgery, constitutes defamation and historical distortion. The forensic authentication of the diary has set standards for verifying other historical documents. Anne Frank's legacy extends into human rights work. The Anne Frank House and related organizations use her story to promote tolerance and oppose discrimination. Educational programs connect the antisemitism and experience to contemporary forms of prejudice, encouraging students to recognize and resist bigotry in their own contexts. This work, while honoring Anne's memory, also fulfills what she wrote in her diary about wanting her work to live on after her death. Historians emphasize that Anne Frank was one victim among millions. She was not more deserving of life than any other Holocaust victim. Her diary survived by chance, preserved by Miep Gies's courage and Otto Frank's determination to publish it. Yet that chance survival has had immeasurable historical impact. Anne's words have educated generations about the Holocaust. Her observations about human nature, recorded while in hiding from those who wanted to murder her, continue to challenge readers to examine their own capacity for both cruelty and courage. The diary remains in print in over 70 languages. New editions continue to be published with updated scholarly apparatus. Schools, museums, and cultural organizations worldwide commemorate Anne Frank. Her face, frozen in photographs at age 13 or 15, has become one of the most recognizable images associated with the Holocaust. This recognition carries the responsibility to remember not just one girl, but the entire catastrophe she represents, and to ensure that her hope that her writing would outlive her has been realized in ways that serve both historical understanding and human dignity. Sources used: Anne Frank, The Book, The Life, The Afterlife by Francine Prose, pages 290–358. The Hidden Life of Otto Frank by Carol Ann Lee, pages 317–389. Witnessing the Disaster, Essays on Representation and the Holocaust, edited by Michael Bernard Donals and Richard Gledger, pages 78–142. The Anne Frank Phenomenon, Then and Now, edited by David Cesarani, pages 201–287. Anne Frank in Historical Perspective, A Teaching Guide for Secondary Schools, published by the Anne Frank House, pages 394. After Anne Frank, Responses to the Diary by Barbara Kirschenblatt Gimblett in the Americanization of the Holocaust, edited by Heileen Flansbaum, pages 127–148.